Maybe some of you can relate, but how I became an audiophile had very little to do with music. I know, how dare me, but it's true. Not that I didn't love music as a child, I just didn't grow up with it. I didn't really have that Rockwellian hi-fi upbringing that many dyed-in-the-wool audiophiles claim to have had. I'm not poking fun, it's just that my hi-fi origin story wasn't all that nostalgic. You see, I grew up in my grandparents' house where music wasn't really on the menu. We had a stereo, a giant Sears branded console if memory serves, and my grandparents' record collection wasn't what a young kid would call cool. Unless, of course, recordings of, polka or military marching bands are your jam. If I wanted to listen to, say, more popular music, I had to hope my aunt didn't mind me eavesdropping on her and her friends as they hung out in her room and listened to Poison or Whitesnake. My love of music was largely born out of playing it. I took classical piano and violin lessons at a very early age, but it wasn't until I was, 10 or 11 years old when my father surprised my mother with a Bose Wave radio that I got my first very own boombox, a hand-me-down Sony all-in-one that had been shown the door thanks to the new hotness from Bose. Before that, if I wanted to listen to my own music, I had a Walkman, another hand-me-down, I think. And as for the music collection, well, it too was limited. I either listened to what my parents liked, or if I managed to save a little, I bought a cassette or two, provided my parents approved it. My prized possessions during this time were my very own copies of REM's Green, Michael Jackson's Bad, and New Kids on the Block, Step by Step. That's it. That was the collection in those early days. My hi-fi journey really began in high school. Like many teens in the 90s, I spent a lot of time in malls and eventually even worked at the local movie theater that was attached to one. My favorite, though, was the Cherry Creek Mall, a more upscale establishment closer to downtown Denver where fancy-to-me stores like Neiman Marcus and Saks Fifth Avenue served as the anchors. Bear in mind, I was only like 15 or so at the time, and to my Nebraska-born country ass, Cherry Creek was tantamount to traveling to a different country. As a result, Cherry Creek Mall represented a lot of firsts for me. It was the first time I was exposed to designer labels, the first time I ate sushi, saw a movie in a theater that didn't have sticky floors or the faint stench of barf. It was also the first time I experienced Bang & Olufsen. Up until that point, my best friend and I, we were into music, but we didn't pay much attention to what we were playing it on. Simpler times. Anyway, I'll never forget the first time we came across the Bang & Olufsen store. It was unlike anything either of us had ever seen. The window displays alone were out of this world. I am talking displays of sleek two-channel setups featuring CD players made out of, largely glass and loudspeakers in every color of the rainbow with zero traces of cables or clutter. Keep in mind that my exposure to hi-fi up until this point was limited to listening rooms at either a Best Buy or Circuit City. You know the type, a wall of speakers, usually JBL, Polk, Infinity, or Bose, connected to God knows what, which you got to control via a giant red button that simply said, "Play Demo." There's nothing unique or unexpected about it. Were those demos fun? Yeah, of course they were, but something about the Bang & Olufsen store, boy, it felt special. And keep in mind, my friend and I, we had no business walking into the B&O store. We may have had $20 in cash between us. We couldn't even afford to buy one of their bottle openers, never mind a pair of $1,200 speakers. It took me all of about a second to know deep in my bones that this place was for me. I had found what I had been looking for. I didn't know I was looking for anything at the time, but I knew I had found it. I walked through that store as if it were a museum. The various CD players, speakers, and TVs, yes, TVs, were priceless works of art to me. And as much as I wanted to play with everything, I didn't dare. Now, my friend, on the other hand, he had to touch everything, and I was so afraid that we were going to get kicked out, and I didn't want to leave, so I kind of kept my distance so as not to be seen as an accomplice. After a few minutes, though, a nice gentleman in a suit approached and asked if we would like to listen to anything. I can't recall which one of us answered first. All I know is it was an almost simultaneous yeah. Despite having a remote in his hand, he walked up to the Biosound 4000, waved his hand like a Jedi, and paused as the player lit up. Its glass doors parted and our jaws hit the floor. He pressed play and the disc, which was vertical, mind you, started to spin as if it were floating in space. And within a second or two, music began to play from the wall-mounted Biolab 4000s resting on either side. I didn't even hear the music at first. I was mesmerized by that backlit spinning CD, again, encased in glass, as the doors slid shut silently over top of it. It was the single coolest thing I had ever seen. And I must have waved my hand in front of that CD player a dozen times, grinning like an absolute fool every time the glass doors parted and then closed again. I wasn't in awe of the gimmick. It was the fluidity of it all, the silence. Keep in mind that in the mid-90s, if you wanted to change a CD inside a CD player, you hit a giant button, waited several seconds for a substantial ka-thunk, followed by the sound of the motors inside spooling up to even know if you were going to get your disc back. If you were impatient, you hit that button again too quickly, you'd have to start all over. Then there was that lunch lady tray that slid out like it was being dragged over gravel for several seconds, sometimes stopping so abruptly at the end that the CD inside would jiggle and jump. Only then were you allowed to change your CD. Polar opposite with the B&O. CDs instead were treated like art. There was no greater example of that than the iconic Biosound 9000, the brand's carousel CD player that featured 6 discs in a row, all floating behind glass, right side up, so that their labels and disc art could be seen from across the room. While I have always been keen on design, I genuinely believe the 9000 is how I came to understand the concept of form and function. That's when I noticed the Biolab 8000 speakers that looked like sharpened aluminum pencils that stood vertically on their points with a single black wire jutting from behind and then disappearing behind a wall. I remember asking, are those speakers? To answer my question, the salesman simply turned up the volume, and I had just never heard anything sound so good, so clear, so clean and perfect. But more importantly, as I shuffled towards the center of the display, I experienced stereo imaging for the first time. It's the 8000s completely vanished from oral view. I looked at my friend and I said, "You can't tell which speaker is playing." I was hooked. I had to have it, all of it. I still didn't really understand what it was. I just knew I wanted it. And that's when the salesman said, "Follow me." And we walked to the back of the store and through a set of velvet curtains behind which was an enclosed room. And in it, the 2 biggest speakers I had ever seen, Biolab Pentas. The Pentas were positioned on either side of a white projection screen, below which were 2 Biolab 4000s mounted side by side for use as a center, and in the rear, 2 more 4000s for surround. He put on the 5th element and just exited the room. What followed was better than any movie theater I had ever been to. But before the scene could even finish, the salesman, he popped his head back in and said, "Oh, sorry, wrong settings." And he hit some weird button on the remote and chaptered back to the beginning of the scene and hit play once again. And what I thought was the best thing I had ever heard, it got even better. Turns out he had forgotten to select the Dolby digital audio layer, like I understood any of that at the time. And the staff left us alone for what seemed like an hour. Were we loitering? Maybe, but I didn't care. We were watching a movie in a theater that was better than a movie theater, and we didn't have to pay for it. Halfway through the 5th element, the salesman, he popped his head back in and he said, "So guys, what color?" Now I laughed because I knew there was no way in hell that I could afford anything in that store. But my friend, now, he had other plans and he asked if he could borrow their phone. Long story short, after a quick phone call and another lengthy demo in the theater, my friend's mom walked in. The 2 toured the store for, 5 minutes before stepping in front of a pair of Biolab 6000s and a Biosound 4000 that was towards the front entrance. And after a second or two, my friend walked over to me with the biggest shit-eating grin I have ever seen. And over his shoulder, I could see his mother hand the salesperson her credit card. And I was like, no f***ing way. Now, it would take me many years before I was able to walk into a B&O store and buy something. But because of that one visit, that one afternoon, not a day went by that I didn't listen to my friend's Bang & Olufsen system as a reminder that I would one day go back. And it was because of that experience that both my friend and I fell down so many different hi-fi rabbit holes. Now, his taste eventually led him towards some pretty esoteric systems, whereas I found myself constantly gravitating towards equipment that captivated me both sonically and visually, which I will admit has cost me a pretty penny over the decades. I had become a full-blown audiophile, though every time it all started to become too much, too much hassle, too many wires, too much stuff to keep track of. I would always find myself back at a Bang & Olufsen store and remembering that first visit and wondering if anything would speak to me the same way their products did and continue to do. I think that's why I'm on the journey I am now and why this time I don't want to stop until I recapture the magic I first experienced all those years ago.